Hey, I have a challenge for you. Stop what you're doing for a second, close your eyes if you can do so safely, focus your mind, and imagine Utopia. What does the world look like when we solve the crises we're facing today? Try to really imagine it. What's happening in this scene? What are people doing? Try following them as they go about their business. What does a day in the life look like? How do they get around? What are they eating for dinner, and where did they get it from? If you didn't manage to answer these questions, or even sustain an image in your head, I don't blame you. Imagining a better future is really hard, especially when things around us seem like they're only getting worse. Even if you've been listening to my show for a while, and you know imagining a brighter future is like my whole thing, you probably still found it hard. I find it hard too. Part of the reason I ask my guests to tell me how Utopia looks to them is that I really struggle to picture it myself. You've probably heard the Mark Fisher quote, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." I know I reference Mark Fisher a lot, but I think his concept of capitalist realism is really important to understanding our present feeling of being stuck, of not being able to imagine any of the possible futures that are out there. But it's really important to realize that feeling of stuckness is constructed. As Morpheus says in The Matrix, it is the world that has been pulled over our eyes. That stuckness is not the truth of the world, but a worldview. Something artificially limiting our vision, keeping us subservient to those in power. Whether those in power are the machines harvesting us for our energy, or the capitalist machine harvesting us for our energy. Man, metaphors, huh? Anyway, that's probably enough nerding about The Matrix for one episode. Point is, there are legit reasons why it's hard to imagine the future, but that doesn't mean there isn't a future. Society is still on its continued trajectory of radical change and transformation, as always. It can be hard to see from our perspective. The shortness and immediacy of our daily lives makes it look like we're sitting still in this instantaneous moment of neoliberal capitalism. But think about how much has changed, for better or for worse, just in your own lifetime. Now zoom out and think about how radically our forms of government and economic organization have changed over the course of world history. You may have heard this line from a speech by Ursula K. Le Guin. Quote, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings." End quote. Le Guin recognized that just because we feel stuck doesn't mean we are. There's also a less quoted essay of hers that I find really interesting. In A War Without End, Le Guin wrestles with that famous question posed by Spinoza and quoted by Deleuze. Why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? Le Guin writes, quote, "I see a danger in insisting that our love of freedom always outweighs whatever force or inertia keeps us from resisting oppression. If I deny that strong, intelligent, capable people will and do accept oppression, I'm identifying the oppressed as weak, stupid, and inept." End quote. In other words, if we assume that the oppressed have both the capability and obligation to resist their oppression, then it's their own fault they're oppressed because they should have resisted more. I hope I don't need to explain how ridiculous this sounds. It's a really unfair and narrow-minded way to think about people facing oppression, especially when they're constantly being told that their demands for freedom and justice are unrealistic. Le Guin continues, quote, "We will not know our own injustice if we cannot imagine justice. We will not be free if we do not imagine freedom. We cannot demand that anyone try to attain justice and freedom who has not had a chance to imagine them as attainable." End quote. The task at hand, then, is more than just organizing our resistance. We have to imagine that resistance is possible in the first place. We have to be able to imagine a better future. But, of course, that isn't easy. So we'd benefit from a sort of imagination toolkit. from well-designed methods that break down barriers and strengthen our imaginative capabilities. I've actually got a great example of this to show you. It's a game designed by some really talented artists and activists that, honestly, I just can't wait to share. So, stay tuned for my interview with Solarpunk Surf Club after the break. You're listening to Solarpunk Now, the podcast about politics, science, art, philosophy, and whatever else it'll take to get us out of this mess. Join us, and let's demand a brighter future together. Per their website, Solarpunk Surf Club is an artist collective that creates and curates egalitarian platforms for surfing the waves of still possible worlds. I came across Solarpunk Surf Club a few months ago, and I was immediately struck by their clear and compelling vision. Like Le Guin, they recognize that art is an important catalyst for radical change and resistance. They're also committed to prefigurative politics, participatory democracy, and tackling the challenges like capitalist realism that Mark Fisher and other theorists have identified. Solarpunk Futures is a card-based tabletop RPG developed by the Solarpunk Surf Club. It's well-researched, beautifully executed, and ultimately a powerful and versatile tool for imagining a better future. Solarpunk Futures uses some really unique mechanics to assist in the imaginative process, making it much easier than I did at the beginning of this episode. Games are a unique artistic medium in that they not only welcome participation, but actually wouldn't function without it. They're a social art because players are active contributors to the game's progression. And even to the game's basic functions, if you count things like hacking, modding, speedrunning, fan theories, and reinterpretations. I could go on here, but who better to explain this game than the designers themselves? Meet Nick and Max, my guests for this episode, and the artists behind Solarpunk Futures.
So together, along with several others, we are Solarpunk Surf Club, an artist collective that creates and curates egalitarian platforms for surfing the waves of still possible worlds. We elaborate on the aesthetics of solarpunk that pre-exists, I think probably most of your listeners are familiar with, in order to bring forth what we see as latent horizontalism, communalism that are inherent in its vision. And generally what that means is artworks that politicize, historicize, and demystify our collective ecological future. And then as individuals, we're not just hiding behind artist collective name. I'm Nick Lyle, and my co-creator.
Yeah, my name is Max, and we co-led the creation of this project, Solarpunk Futures. And let's see, we're based... soon we'll both be based in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Nick is already there. And I'm in Madison, Wisconsin right now.
How did the group come together?
We formed, well, several of us were in grad school in an MFA program, although we do have non-formally trained members as well. And we kind of joined forces around, we'd all been longtime makers of some kind, and we joined forces around our first project in 2020. It was called Green Room, and we transformed a public library's art gallery into a public living room for what we called utopian creation and recreation. And the project kind of brought together our interest in multimedia, transdisciplinary research, collaboration, and we created a kind of site-responsive participatory space within the library. As far as this game actually was supposed to be part of Green Room, but one of the first activities that we did as a collective was we listed out affinity values that we wanted to sort of guide our work. We were all kind of influenced by things like tarot and oracle decks, and particularly oblique strategies. And we wanted to kind of devise a way to activate this list, and somewhere along the line hit on the idea of a tabletop game, specifically a storytelling game.
This was the first time you had made a game, right? And you did a lot of background research about game design and games as a sort of political or moral education.
Yeah, we did a little bit of research. I mean, some of the research was done in playing games in our own free time, especially during the long years of and continuing years of COVID. I started playing some tabletop role-playing games online with some friends to stay connected and have some fun, and found them to be really interesting spaces for role-playing, right? And role-playing different worlds, different people, sometimes magical spaces, but it didn't seem like it would be too far of a stretch to play within a future in which we could use role-playing to do some of those things we talked about at the beginning, where we're historicizing, politicizing, and demystifying a future that can feel inevitably dim, and we wanted to try and counteract that. But yeah, we looked into a number of sort of the history of games as pedagogical tools being used, or I mean, I think games always have a pedagogical element in them, and there's a long history. There's games from 6,000 years ago that have been found in ancient Sumeria, the royal game of and more familiar and actually the rules are I believe fairly well known. The ancient Egyptian game Senet, and Max, you found another one that was it the Peacock game?
Oh yeah, it's the Game of the Goose.
That's
different
right.
bird. Game of the Goose from 15th century. Well, I guess what today is Italy. But yeah, it combined these sort of large form illustrations, really exquisite detail, and for the time, a kind of like overt didactic moral instruction. So yeah, I guess we found that games sort of fit two of our interests are in an artistic sense. So like new media, people who are excited about the idea that pretty much anything can be art or has the potential to be art, and we embrace that kind of radical formal pluralism. And the other current, I guess, is social practice, which kind of comes out of a theater history, but looking at people, particularly social groups, ensembles of people as a medium. And games felt like a way to connect to both this sort of deep history of, in the sense that, people have been making games for millennia, and it just seemed like a fertile intersection to explore.
Yeah, I'll even add, storytelling games themselves are also just as ancient, even though they don't show up as easily in the archaeological record because they're more oral. But even like a kind of telling the biggest lie about how big the fish you caught is a kind of storytelling game that is less formally codified. But I think more recently I've discovered these kind of independent tabletop role-playing games that have been doing really interesting things and kind of breaking down some of the barriers or being more expansive about what can be defined as a game. And so we definitely took a lot of inspiration from those as well.
Something that strikes me is there's a lot that makes your game unique among tabletop games. It takes this approach that, what's the word I'm looking for? Back. Oh, I wrote it down. You
Backcasting?
guys had this backcasting. Great word. Love that. So I'm really interested in, as you said, every game inevitably has its own messages, its own logics, and it seems like you have a very conscious recognition of that, and you wanted the structure of your game to inspire the sort of social practice that you were trying to bring into the world.
Yeah, backcasting is a really interesting device because it takes the same story. You could ask people what the future looks like, or you could ask people assume utopia and tell us how you got there. And it's the same middle part, but one of them almost always ends up in a sort of dystopian future, and the other feels natural to be optimistic about how we can get to utopia. And so it's been a really powerful device for helping people think about the future in a way that gets beyond the cynicism that a lot of us have when we are looking at the world and the news and the way that the climate crisis has been approached and whatnot. And it's not, we explicitly resist magical cures. We don't want people to be, invent a perpetual motion machine to solve their problems. But we do think that there's a pathway for us as humanity to get to a utopian future. And so we ask people to assume that and then tell us how they got there. And so I think just kind of the quick overview of how the game is played. So basically the players are part of the assembly for the future in a future utopia, and they're asked to remember their ancestors who helped overcome the challenges from the world before. And so players, there's 4 sets of cards, and players draw an ancestor and a value card, and they give their ancestors a name. They remember a detail or two about them. Then the players collectively draw a single challenge card as a group and describe it a little bit. And not just describe it, but remember why it was so difficult, why it was so intractable, and why it was so counter to the ancestors' values, as stated in those original value cards. And the third round of the game is where players spend a little bit of time writing down a couple points about how their ancestor first approached the challenge with 2 tool cards that they draw. And those tools are broadly interpreted tools. So those include things like participatory budgeting and communal meals. So a kind of broad range of creative possibilities emerge as players try and consider how they are going to combat a challenge like deforestation using the tools that they kind of draw randomly. But we also ask players how they failed. We say in that third round, you didn't succeed. You didn't, you brought some people together, you made an impact, you set some things up for success maybe, but somebody pushed back. There was too much momentum for the status quo. Something got in the way, and we asked players to figure out what that was. So that in the final round of the game, the players can talk about how they all come together and overcome the challenge using their combined skills, combined ancestors, and combined stories that they've generated so far. So it's pretty simple in a lot of ways, or not, maybe not simple, but it's not difficult, but it really creates some interesting and emergent possibilities when people are combining these ancestors and values and tools in really interesting ways that I've found surprising again and again, despite having put a lot of time into thinking about all of these ancestors, tools, and values. So I think other people do as well.
We were inspired, I guess, in a negative sense by capitalist realism and trying to overcome this like cancellation of the future idea, or the idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. At the same time, if you just ask someone to imagine themselves 5-10 years in the future, that is an incredibly daunting and nearly impossible thing to do. So part of our interest in backcasting, which we actually took from psychology literature as a way to facilitate thinking about yourself in the future. We were also influenced by what Jay Springett has called the core solarpunk question, which is, what does a sustainable civilization look like, and how do we get there? And so we kind of wanted to reformulate that using the backcasting in a way that made it, we think, easier for people to start to answer. So that could take the form of something like, given what our sustainable world looks like, how did we get there? And so our we call it a festival, but the festival concept allows players to imagine from the standpoint of Utopia, people like themselves in positions of historical consequence. And yeah, I think that just ties into something that's materially true, which is that we live in the amalgam of other people's once futures. So we hope that the reminder that all futures are built in the present empowers players with like these ideas of ecological vision for the stories that they want to like manifest in their real lives.
I really admire, like, this game offers so much space, there's so much freedom in it, but at the same time there's enough structure and, you know, like there are values latent in it that just, it's reading through the rule book, it's like reading the affinity principles or guidelines for some sort of utopian organization. It's like holding space for people to express themselves. I'd like to talk about lines and veils, as you called them. You're incorporating, you know, an awareness of trauma and like the importance of consent and setting boundaries and just like making this a comfortable space to talk about these very challenging issues that people have firsthand experience with today.
Yeah, as in addition to being artists, we're also both organizing people to build change in our local communities. So a lot of the principles that are embedded in the structures come from our experience organizing. But Lines and Veils is actually one that I encountered in an indie tabletop role-playing game called Legacy: Life Among the Ruins, which is already has a lot of Solarpunk vibes to it. I recommend it. It's got a lot going on. But yeah, I encountered the Lines and Veils concept there and found it extremely useful, and actually something that I've brought into some of my organizing work as an accessible way to talk about triggers and trauma. So the basic principle for anybody who hasn't heard of this concept is lines are things that aren't crossed. So they are points in the story that don't happen, topics that are completely avoided when you're telling the story of your Solarpunk future. And veils can be alluded to, but happen off screen. So, you know, perhaps hunger is something somebody's not comfortable talking about for whatever reason. And they say, you know, this can be something that is a veil, not a line. So this can happen off screen. You can allude to there being a lot of a food shortage, but you don't go into depth about character grappling with that situation or something like that. And importantly, these things can be established at the beginning. You know, they should be talked about at the beginning of the game, but they can also be established as they're going, because nobody carries around with them a list of everything that might make it difficult for them to have a good time playing a game, because ultimately, I think, as we say in the game book, the 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 integrity of the group is more important than discussing any particular topic.
Right.
In other words, just in the same way that to be a compelling utopian vision, it needs to be grounded in material realities. I think similarly, it needs to be grounded in like psychological material realities of how individuals change, how individuals heal, how individuals become more complete beings. And so that's something that we wanted to pay kind of equal attention to in constructing the interpersonal dynamics through the rules.
It seems to me that your game is an example of prefigurative politics, engaging in the social practices that this utopian future is going to need. It's like a way of embodying where we want to go in the present.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think that was something we wanted to be intentional about, thinking of our work as prefigurative. I found a definition I like written by Paul Rakestad and Sofia Graydon, and they define it as the deliberate experimental implementation of desired future social relations and practices in the here and now. And so, yeah, the world we want to see is one that foregrounds human liberation and maximizes freedom, and the artistic works we produce, we want to reflect this in their construction. So how is Solarpunk Futures prefigurative? I think we were just talking about the lines and veils, attention to caring dialogue that's informed by trauma. Also the practice of consensus decision making. So like discussing plans, airing objections, adapting proposals in order to try and achieve a consensus. I think the game helps people practice a kind of synthesis between different sorts of reasoning, like ethical reasoning about what ought to be, and the instrumental reason of the means to achieve those ends. Nick was talking about the game book narrative being structured in such a way that there will be obstacles and adversaries along the way. So players need to sort of think ahead and strategize and collaborate to fully overcome each challenge. And yeah, by the way, the framing of overcoming the challenge does imply their abolition, not their management. And then I guess another prefigurative aspect of the game would be sharpening people's revolutionary vocabulary. So the game performs a kind of direct political educational role.
Some other things that I can think of as well are it's a GM-less role-playing game. So there's a sort of egalitarianism. Everybody has an equal epistemological stance in terms of telling the truth of what happened, remembering their ancestors and how they overcame the challenges of the world before. And similarly, there's no GM or game master to punish or reward players for doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Players are kind of in charge of that for themselves. There's no grade at the end. There's no points, and so I think that's another element of the prefiguration that we tried. And then the last thing, I think I'd mentioned this a little bit when I talked about how the game runs, but one of the things we really wanted to do is resist a sort of heroic individualism that's really common in narrative fiction and especially film. And so, as I mentioned before, mid-game players are essentially asked how their ancestors failed as individuals, because we wanted to ensure that the ultimate power that players can tap into is collective action.
Yeah, that was something that really struck me when I watched your playthrough. So you have like the game sort of starts out in an individual phase. Everyone's developing their own character. and their reasons for trying to fight the challenge that they're working on. But it's not until the collective phase where they weave all the stories together. And something the rulebook also does is outlines how that weaving takes place in a way that's consensual and honors everyone's perspective. So I would love to touch just briefly on the IRL RFN game mode. Quick side note, that's short for in real life, right effing now. Just think that's really fun. This game can be used like as an actual organizing tool, as just like a way to brainstorm things we can actually go out and do.
Yeah, I think one of the inspirations that we had making this game, and Max mentioned earlier, was Oracle decks or Tarot decks. And I think that this game mode, in some ways, is the most directly inspired from those, where you, as a player, but in this case more explicitly an organizer, there's much less kind of fiction around it, are trying to figure out how to approach a real world challenge and drawing tools and values and exploring those possibilities as a way to organize better, to overcome that real world challenge. So I think the tools and the values and everything are kind of diverse enough and are accessible enough as well. Almost none of the tools are things that are outside the ability of a medium-sized group in any city in the US to put together. So that, that's also something that makes the game accessible and the future building feel accessible. But yeah, I think the IRL RFN game mode was one alternative game mode that we imagined that you could use these cards, and we would love to see more. So if people have thoughts or ideas about how they're using the cards or want to create new ways to play different games using all or a subset of the cards in new ways, we'd love to hear about them and share them with others. And we even considered adding different taxonomies or sort of suits to each card, things like locations of revolutionary inspiration or dates of historic acts of freedom. Although the dates are actually already on all of the tool cards, so I could see somebody using those in some interesting ways to create a new game mode. So just trying to prime the inspiration pump for any listeners out there who might be game designers or prospective ones.
Yeah, it reminds me of something you mentioned briefly, oblique strategies, like the deck of cards to like spark inspiration for artists, and it's all these weird things. I mean, they're oblique. It's not like draw a painting of a house or whatever. It's like try doing it backwards, or cut it all up and paste it together, stuff like that. And it sounds like that's been a theme in your work as a collective, is like creating spaces or avenues for social practice for people to sort of take things in their own direction and get inspiration, but still have enough freedom to develop their own methods.
Yeah, I think Oblique Strategies has been for almost like a decade now, has been a constant well of inspiration. I do keep a copy on my desk. And I have a card facing me now that says gardening, not architecture. And I really like this card because of what it says about the artistic process. I think it points towards this kind of middle ground. So like on one extreme, there's the blueprint model of making that you see like in architecture, where you have, or a certain kind of architecture in a paradigmatic sense, where you have like a complete total vision of what you're making. And then you execute it. And then on the other end of the continuum is like a totally intuitive process, totally improvisational, where you don't have a plan, you're just in a flow state making. And then I think about gardening metaphorically as this kind of middle ground where you're like planting a seed and you sort of, you know what seed you've planted and you can kind of anticipate how it might grow, but something unexpected is going to happen. And then you can make a decision to harvest, to transplant, to propagate. And I just think that that's like an incredibly inspiring idea for making. And I do think that that's kind of we don't talk about it all the time, but I think that that's something that we all kind of share as a like a philosophy of making.
So I do want to talk about the visual language of the game, both the actual art on the cards, the decision to use cards, the way they're laid out on the space on the game table. How did you develop the game as a physical object, and how did you design the cards for it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a multi-year project, so these decisions accumulated along the way. It was not a blueprint. We didn't have it all in our heads at the beginning. But the form of the cards was inspired by a single photovoltaic cell. And then we kind of hit on the formal, there's kind of like a isometric symmetry with a floppy disk. And so, of course, we were inspired by the association of like knowledge and power, or the archive and energy as power. As far as the illustrations, I think there is a kind of growing consensus in Solarpunk around drawing from like Art Nouveau, the arts and crafts movement. We bring some other influences into that as well, like anarchist aesthetics, like from info shops, prolet cult. But the basic idea is that we wanted for players to be able to kind of like see themselves in the picture. So there's, in a lot of the early Solarpunk imagery, I know people have talked a lot about this, like it's really more of an eco-modernist aesthetic where you see these like slick cityscapes devoid of people. So we wanted to definitely center people in our compositions. Also, we used the strategy of anti-portraiture, where the subjects are always facing away. You're always kind of looking over their shoulder. It's a similar formal strategy that's used in video games, like a third-person, somewhat omniscient perspective. But again, it's kind of going for this idea of immersion, players being able to take on these ancestral roles and see themselves as agents in the action. And then as far as like the specific style of figuration, I think as far as like why not use like photorealism? Our feeling was that we're saturated by photoreal images like in the media, even the most like horrible thing, images of like police brutality or imperialist war, climate refugees. And I think there's kind of a numbing effect because of the degree to which we're inundated with those kinds of images. So, well, the game doesn't show anything graphic like that. The challenge cards are just text only. The illustrations are on the ancestor cards. But that was kind of background in our thinking about that, where something rendered figuratively can actually let you see it in a fresh way.
Totally. For me, like looking at the art, the word that comes to mind is dreamlike. Like in a dream, there are these figures. You can't ever see their faces, but you know who they are. You can feel these connections with them in a way you can't if it's like a photorealistic image that we're just bombarded with.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, somewhere between a dream and a memory, maybe, given the backcasting.
Totally. I'm curious how how you hope people will use the game, or in what settings? Like, who do you want to get this game out to?
In terms of who we want playing the game, I think we want a whole range of people. Anybody who's interested in building a better future, especially thinking about artists, thinking about teachers, thinking about organizers. Organizations, I think, could potentially use this successfully. We also have some ideas for facilitating a workshop at some upcoming conferences where we would have a number of different groups playing the game simultaneously, all overcoming the same challenge, but obviously with radically different stories and interpretations, and probably a lot of overlap as well. And then spending some time sharing those stories, sharing some key insights, and also debriefing about what we can learn from where those stories are similar or different, or where we got hung up, where our own imaginations failed us or it surprised us. So I think that's something we're very excited about as well.
Is there anything that's really surprised you as designers, like watching other people play the game? I think you mentioned in another interview that like you had your family members play it and you were really surprised by the stuff that came out of their conversation.
Yeah, I was playing with some family members who, they are probably progressive people, and I think they spend a lot of time, like most of us, worrying about the present and how we can make maybe incremental progress from this moment. And I was delighted to see them really getting into thinking way beyond incremental progress in playing the game. And I think one of the most as an artist, you're always worried about how people receive it. So while I always hoped people would play it and it would inspire them to really think about it, I was happily surprised when, after playing it several weeks later, people called me up and said, "Hey, I'm still thinking about XYZ from the game," or that's really made me think about this challenge in a new way. And those kinds of things are very exciting.
Yeah, I guess that makes me think about a couple things. One is, last summer we spent playtesting. Every week we had people coming over to, we were part of this distributed festival called Homestretch that was organized by the artist duo Spatula and Barcode, who were coincidentally the collaborative chairs of my MFA committee. But basically we had people coming over and we got to play with tons of people. And that really helped define and refine the flow of the game. And I was struck at it kind of didn't really matter like what the challenge was or what the tools and values were. People ended up hitting on the need for like community controlled eminent domain, which, a past generation might have called dictatorship of the proletariat. That just seems like the thing that people kept coming around to. So that was, I guess, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but it's definitely something that I noticed in those early play tests. On a different note, I guess it's always an interesting experience when Nick and I play with people. There's definitely I think from the other player's perspective, there's the sense of like, am I playing it right? They kind of look to us as this like de facto GM. And I find myself as a player, I have a kind of like a split consciousness of myself as a player and as a game designer. So I'm like constantly thinking on like a meta level while we play. I think that's kind of led us towards not playing with people. Like you mentioned the Gamers for Peace live stream. We had decided by then to not participate ourselves as players. Just because I think it just works out better when we remove that opportunity for players to kind of like default to us for direction. And I really like seeing people play, kind of like break the game, basically, like play in slightly unconventional ways, because that can sometimes give us new ideas or just expands our own thinking.
The game contains a lot of optional rules, and I think a lot of those came from play tests where people broke the game in interesting ways, and we said, oh, well, we always assumed that the game was going to be played in a world that looks similar to the way it is now, but somebody just decided to play from a dystopian future and get to Utopia from there. A very specific dystopia in this case. And so we added that as an optional rule. And I think a lot of the optional rules evolved out of stuff like that.
So this is the second edition of your game you have coming out. I know you probably have some information about the release date and stuff like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a specific release date for the second edition, but we are accepting pre-orders on our website, which is thefuture.wtf. We owe a couple hundred games to Kickstarter backers who helped us make the second edition a reality. And immediately after fulfilling those Kickstarter orders, we'll be fulfilling pre-orders that are made through our website. There are a limited number because we are ultimately artists, not a game publisher. So we don't have unlimited funds to print really large editions at this time. So if people want one, definitely recommend ordering one. And we expect them to be shipped within the next month. So it's soon. We're finalizing a couple things now.
Awesome. So what was the reasoning behind the second edition? Have you expanded it or made some changes?
Yeah, there have been a number of changes. First off, the first edition was really an artist level print. So we were able to make the first edition happen thanks to some artist grants that we received. And we only printed 50 games from that first edition. So we had a lot of additional interest after those 50 games, which made us very happy, but also gave us an opportunity to revisit some of the game book and add some new art, new cards into the game as well. So the second edition, which was funded through the Kickstarter, we are printing 500, and the biggest changes to the game book were a restructuring of how the game plays in order to provide a little bit more accessible scaffolding toward that final phase. I think rather than kind of loading a lot of the game into the front end as we did before, we spaced it out a little bit better and moved some meta questions about the game, about what the experience of playing the game was like, some of the more pedagogical questions that people might visit after playing the game, into a sort of optional postscript that people can use. And we did that largely because we got some really good feedback from a teacher who said, I would love to play this game with some high school students, but I think they might have some trouble with essentially not having quite enough scaffolding. And so not only did we revise some of the structure, although the overall game is largely very similar, we also added a notepad that has a Mad Lib type fill in the blank that really is the very accessible way to play the game. Could be a way that people play, individually, to generate ideas if they wanted, although the best ideas definitely come from those emergent combinations of players. And we hope to people be able to use with kids or students or others who maybe don't have as much experience with storytelling or with role-playing games. And then we added a whole bunch of new cards. Maybe, Max, you want to talk about those?
Yeah, that's part of the reason why, I mean, we're working as fast as we can, but just making what we called this like prototype or first edition of the game was, well over a year in the making. And, in our enthusiasm in the Kickstarter campaign, we created these stretch goals of offering to create, new cards in each category. And we actually ended up hitting all of those stretch goals. So that has meant a lot more illustrating, a lot more research. Each card requires a great amount of research. If it's like a challenge, we're looking at academic papers, reading excerpts from books, trying to really get our heads around describing this in a succinct way that kind of does like justice to the full scope of the challenge. If it's a value, we're like consulting multiple dictionaries and going back and forth, wordsmithing exact word choices. If it's a tool, the supplementary text there is a quote, and so we're pouring through relevant references of people that we might want to index, and then sourcing a quote from them, and then the ancestors are kind of their own challenge in both coming up with this like character archetype or persona, and then trying to visually represent them, and then coming up with some kind of like helper terms or alternative ways of describing the ancestor that push beyond like obvious just like synonyms, but maybe can kind of stretch how people might play with the card to keep the game as kind of expansive and generative as it can be. So that's I guess a long way to say we're working as fast as we can, and are pretty much done at this point. We just have some final steps of the cards to finish up, and we're working with a great print shop in Santa Cruz called Community Printers. They're a worker-owned print co-op. They've helped us do some. They specialize in sustainable material design, and so they've helped us select all the different papers and materials for the game components going into the game. And we're really excited in particular about this paper that is coated in mica, also known as like fool's gold. But it has a really wonderful, like kind of subtle luster or sparkle to it, and has the advantage of not, putting plastics or heavy metals into the soil or water. So we're really excited about that, and yeah, you can cut me off whenever.
I mean, I'm just impressed. Like, it was already clear to me looking at the game how much work has got into it. It's so well thought out. Like, there's no word wasted on those cards. It's really great to see how much passion is going to this project. I'm really excited about it.
I'll mention that the game is also available for free online to anyone at our website, which again is thefuture.wtf, as a print and play version. So even if you bought the first edition game and want the updated game book rules, those are the new edition, the second edition, the Kickstarter edition of the game is all live on the print and play.
Okay, so the last question is, what does Utopia look like to you?
I think there's two ways we could answer that question. On one level, we made the game with an explicit social ecological politics, politics of post-scarcity, post-work, or where work and play become integrated to the point where the distinction dissolves, where production is based on need, not for profit, where people are directly involved in democratic decision-making over every aspect of their lives, and where communities are in sustainable interrelation with the environment around them. And there's a lot of room, even within those specific utopias, for for many different possible societies to exist. And that's kind of, I think, one of the directions that we took this question when we were thinking through it. And maybe Max, you want to talk through that?
Yeah, in many ways, it's a utopia of process. And I think that ties into the question about prefiguration. It's not just our idea of utopia, or like, in other words, a single totalizing utopia. The whole point is that, like, there are blank cards in each category. The whole point is that players are supposed to add their ideas to the game. And so through the game as a kind of system for generating utopias, they can kind of elaborate I guess you could call it like a democracy of utopias, where people are elaborating an idea of utopia through the process embedded in the game. And yeah, I think to Nick's point, many specific utopias could be governed by a shared set of like principles going into them. Like he was talking about direct democracy, post-scarcity, feminism, care. And in that way, I think it's kind of like the Zapatista slogan, like a world in which many worlds fit. So I guess that's a long way of saying that's our utopia. It's a utopia in which many utopias fit.
Confabula, a play allegedly of mythic origins, rewritten countless times. This abridged version is my adaptation of the play as recorded by the artist Borealis. Characters: artist and guest. Scene: a queer little room, domestic and dreamlike. Time: relative. Possibly the future.
Our myths have consequences, you know? For example, check out this mural, Lumberjack Fight at the Flambeau River. At first, it seems like this mural is valorizing workers, or maybe documenting local lore. But whose lore? Aren't there people missing from this scene? And honestly, can I say this kind of thing around here? It's also kind of queer, you know?
Yeah, so it's fabulous, but it's complicated. You designed this set, right? And I'm assuming you wrote the script?
Oh, me? No.
But it says in the script that you're the artist. Right here, your lines are labeled artist, and mine are labeled guest.
That can't be right. I assure you, the artist is not present.
Well, then how'd this script get here? Maybe you've been working on it so long that you can't remember anymore. Or you relied on so many people to pull this together that you've forgotten your role in all of it.
Hey, I hate to disappoint you, but I ain't the artist.
Okay, alright. I believe you. Well, we might as well acknowledge that we're both here right now and probably have stories to share, right? What's on your mind?
I've been thinking a lot about isolation, how all the absences around us are suddenly conspicuous. In a lot of ways, we've been alienated from each other, and I'm talking long before COVID. It's got me wondering who my kin are, if kinship is something real, or if it's a myth we tell ourselves to get by.
I think I'm following. Like, the pandemic has us thinking about who we really want to be in good relation with, who we want to be in solidarity with, you know?
Right. Maybe I tell myself that kinship is a myth because I don't want to believe my own responsibility in keeping the friendships that I need to survive. Maybe we don't want to admit the pain we feel when solidarity frays around the edges and shows us something eroded underneath. Maybe kinship is impossible when there's a hero involved. Like, kinship is fundamentally an unheroic kind of story.
Maybe kinship is creating common stories? Maybe we aren't caring for each other when we believe different stories.
I like that. If stories help us imagine a future for ourselves, sharing that future with others, letting them play with it and build upon it, that's an act of care. What if we told stories that helped us commit to each other?
Okay, I get it. We're writing this play together, 'cause no one person can predict the future. Our futures are determined by how we relate to one another. Like right now, sharing this space together. A living room is just a room, but it invites us to use it in ways that are mutually caring, ways that foster kinship.
But isn't that just a little bit too literal? Isn't art supposed to be a little bit more mysterious, more fantastical, more, I don't know, abstract?
I mean, artists are humans too. They live in the same world. They have their own ideas, hopes, and fears. Then again, they also can't expect the minutiae of their thought to be understood through their art. Or maybe they can, but not exactly as they choose? Like, artists, their art, and even the gallery are all bound up together, but they're afraid of what that complicity means, so they protect themselves in abstractions that obscure what they're really thinking about.
Maybe abstractions happen when artists collaborate with their surroundings in order to make sense of the world. Maybe abstractions are signifiers of something very real, but are coded in such a way that only our kin can perceive and elaborate upon them.
So you're saying that kinship is a sort of co-authorship. That means Confabula isn't the final presentation of the private ideas of one artist, but an invitation to carry the art further.
Yeah, totally. But, well, co-authorship is a neat concept, but art galleries are more about observation and contemplation. What if I was looking forward to sharing a kind of more thoughtful silence between us today, where we don't have to speak to understand each other?
Then maybe we shouldn't have filled this play with so many words, huh?
Fair enough.
You know, I think we're always making meaning out of what we experience, whether we share those ideas or not. So maybe we need to share those ideas out loud and build shared stories that actually liberate us, that help us imagine a brighter future.
I want to believe that, but I'm never satisfied with what I write. I feel like the words never quite come out right.
Isn't that what rewrites are for? It's okay to say what we feel and evolve our thinking over time. We could change the words every time we run this play. You and me, we can change this story right now. Solarpunk Now is written, hosted, and produced by me, Luca Dowell. My guests today were Nick and Max of the Solarpunk Surf Club. You can get your copy of the game Solarpunk Futures at thefuture.wtf, see the Surf Club's other projects at solarpunksurf.club, or follow them on Twitter at solarpunkclub. As always, those links are in the description. The play was Confabula, a play of allegedly mythic origin, as recorded by Borealis, modified by me, and performed by myself and Philip Stanley. The Solarpunk theme song is by Red Keener on SoundCloud, with additional music by Gabriel Rivas. You can follow the show on Twitter at SolarpunkCast or visit solarpunkcast.net for all episodes, including show notes. You can also visit solarpunkcast.net to donate to the show. I do all of this myself and I don't run ads, so your support is greatly appreciated. That's solarpunkcast.net, link in the description. And remember, the realization of any vision requires action. I strongly encourage you to get involved with local organizations whose goals align with the brighter future you want to see. Analysis is important, but we have to back it up with practice. Keep dreaming big, and keep up the good work.